this video, we're going to talk about the process of receiving input from standard input. The process of receiving input is slightly more complicated than the process of creating output, and that's because the command that receives input is formatted differently for string data than it is for numeric data. So you have to think about the kind of information that you'll be receiving and then use the appropriate command. Let's first look at the input process for string information. Remember that string is a fancy computer science word that means character-based data. The general format for receiving input from standard input into a string looks like this. In the command, we have the reserved word input. That's what tells Python that we would like to receive data from standard input, the keyboard. And we have to store that information somewhere. And so we have a variable identifier over here on the left-hand side. So we have to say, assign to this variable, using the assignment operator, the result of this input process. So Python would always execute this input process that's over here on the right-hand side, and then it's going to store the result in the variable whose identifier is indicated on the left-hand side. Now, how would the user know what kind of information you're expecting? Well, you have to tell them. So in these parentheses, you include a prompt. That's text information that explains to the user the kind of information that you're expecting. That tells them what they should enter and gives them some context. So the format for the input statement is a variable identifier, then the assignment operator, then the reserved word input to say that you're receiving input from standard input, and finally, a prompt label that tells the user what kind of information you're expecting them to type. Let's look at a few examples. I'm going to move my examples over here so that we can see our Python window, and I'm going to store these examples in a file. And storing them in the file will help us to see the interactive nature of the Python program better. So my first example says, name assignment operator, input, please enter your name. And again, name is the identifier associated with the variable where we're going to store the information entered by the user. Then we have the assignment operator, then the reserved word input, and you can tell it's a reserved word because Python has highlighted it purple. And then finally, the prompt is the string of information that explains to the user what you're expecting them to type. Remember that when you're storing the information in a file, it doesn't execute the statements right away. Instead, it saves them all up and only executes them after you choose to run the program. Let's enter the second example input statement. What's your major? So again, the big picture format, we have the reserved word input. We provided the prompt, what's your major? That tells the user what you expect them to type. And then you're saying where you'd like to store their information. You want to store it in a variable called major. And then finally, a last bit of text information. Ask them to input your favorite color. So we're saying color, assignment operator, input, tell me your favorite color. Python's going to read all of the input in these three examples as text information. Let's run our program just to see how it works. So we've saved our file, and now Python's giving us the very first prompt. Let me move our Python code over here so you can see it side by side. The very first prompt says, please enter your name. Python's displayed that prompt to the user so that they know what to type. And now it's waiting for the user to enter their input. You see this blinking cursor here, which is an indicator that it's waiting for me to type. So I can enter my name and then press enter. And once I do that, Python reads in the value of my name and stores it in the variable whose identifier is name in my software. After it does that, it moves to the next executable line in the program. So it's asking me, what's my major? And again, it's waiting for me to type some input. I can tell that because the cursor is blinking over here and it's not advancing to the next line. So when it says, what's your major? You can type that in. I was a math major when I was an undergrad, so I'll input that and then press enter. Once I press enter, it saves this information that I entered, math, in the variable whose identifier is major in my software. After it does that, it moves to the next line in the program where it says, tell me your favorite color. So it's printed that to the screen. It's waiting for me to enter my favorite color. When I do that, Python stores the information that I enter, pink, and stores that in the variable whose identifier is color. And that's the last executable line in our software. So after that, it completes the execution of the program and shows the Python prompt again. So we've seen some examples of how to receive input as text in our program. And one thing that I wanted to mention is that sometimes when you're writing a program, you want to receive numeric information, but you're really not going to treat it as a number in that you're not going to do any kind of mathematical calculations with it. And it's okay to enter a number using one of these text prompts. So for example, you have an ID number at UMW, but you usually don't like multiply that by anything or find the integer remainder of your ID number modulus a certain value. Generally, when you have a long string of data like ID numbers, you're just using it to uniquely identify a person, and you can really treat that number as text. You don't have to store it as a numeric value. So we could, in our program, say, enter your ID number, and store it in this variable called ID number. And because we're using the format for receiving the information as a string, Python's going to receive that information and treat it as though it were a string. Let's run our program, see how that works. Enter your name, enter your major, enter your favorite color, tell me your ID number. And you can see that it was just fine accepting those numeric values as text input. Python's always happy to treat a number as though it were text. Let's now look at some examples where we want to receive numeric input and we're going to actually perform calculations on that input. So we just created that program that asked for the ID number and received the numeric information but stored it as text. Let's prove that it's storing it as text. Suppose we print ID number. It prints out the value that I entered, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And if I do something like total equals ID number times 2, because it's treating it as text information, when I print the total, it's going to print 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And that's because it's using the text-based multiplication operator, the one that repeats the string a specific number of times. So it's repeating my ID number twice rather than performing a mathematical calculation with it. It's no problem to store numeric data as text if you're only going to treat it as text. But if you wanted to be able to perform regular multiplication, addition, subtraction, or other mathematical operations on your numeric data, then you have to do a little bit of extra work when you receive the input. Let's look at an example. So the extra step that we need when we're reading numeric data is called a typecast command. And here's how it works. It looks really similar to a regular input command. You still have your variable identifier. You still have your assignment operator. You still have the word input, the reserved word, indicates you're going to receive data from standard input. And you still have your prompt that explains to the user what you're expecting them to enter. The new and different part is that you have to include the data type that you want to use to store the information right here in front of the input command. And that typecast, including that other data type here, is what tells the computer to read the user's input and then treat it as a non-string data type. So you can include int or float here to indicate that you want to treat the data as an integer or as a decimal value. Let's look at some examples. So suppose that in our program, change it in the actual program, we want to receive the input about the ID number, and we want to treat this particular value as an integer. I'm going to add int in here with parentheses around my input command to say, take everything that you receive as input as this ID number, treat it as an integer, and store it in this variable ID number. And then let's print out the ID number. And let's also calculate that total that we were trying to calculate before. Total equals ID number times 2. Print the total. Let's run the program to see how it behaves. So I'm still starting with my regular input prompts, expecting the text information, Karen, math, peak. Tell me your ID number, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And now you can see we got very different results. So it printed out the value of my ID number, and that part's indistinguishable. We can't tell whether it's printing the ID number as text or whether it's printing it as a numeric value. When it displays to the screen to the end user, both look exactly the same. But here, when we make the mathematical calculation with the ID number, we can tell that Python's doing something different. Instead of repeating the string the way that it did when we stored it as text, now it's performing the multiplication operator, and it multiplied our ID number by the value 2, found the result, and stored it as total, which we were then able to print out. All of these are examples of conversations between the computer and the end user. Remember, anytime the software prompts the user for information and the user responds, the computer's having a conversation with the end user and is able to save the information that they enter so the software can behave the way it's designed. Let's look at a few more examples. Suppose we wanted to allow somebody to enter their birth year. I'm going to type these just as at the Python prompt. So you can see that how Python reacts differently when it is executing input statements in the interpreter window instead of a file. I want to treat this as numeric data. So I put the typecast int in there, and now I'm using the reserve port input to receive my input. Enter the year of your birth is my prompt. And when I type that in, now Python gives me my prompt, enter the year of your birth, and now it's waiting for me to enter something. You can tell it's waiting because of the cursor that's blinking and because you don't see the prompt popping up on that line. So if I type 1997 here, it's stored that information as birth year, and now I can print out the value birth year, and Python will print out the 1997. Let's do an example with a floating point value. Suppose I want to store somebody's age. So I ask them, how old are you? Enter that. Python will print out the prompt. It's waiting for me to type input. I can tell because it's not moving on to the prompt, and there's a cursor that's blinking. So if I type 10.5 and then print age, Python will print out 10.5. So if you want to treat numeric input as an integer, you put the data type int in front of the input command. And if you want to treat the input as a decimal value, you put the data type float in front of the input command.